Well, welcome everybody to our partner webinar series. Today's session, The Elephant in the Room, 5 Ways to Mitigate the Risk of Unstructured Data. I am Michael Haley. I am currently the ARMA Board President, and I will be your host and moderator today. I'm really excited to be able to join our experts from ActiveNav, Rich Tolbert, Andrew Cohen, as we explore this exciting topic. Before we jump into the topic, though, Andrew, if you would just move ahead to the next slide, just a word about ARMA. If you are not a current member, I highly encourage you to join us. I encourage you to join us so that you can explore all the benefits of being an ARMA member. We are introducing members-only webinar series this year. We have one coming up next week. Values-based IM policies. If you're a current member and you haven't yet signed up for this session, please go to the ARMA events calendar and sign up for that. And if we go to the next slide, a little plug for ARMA InfoCon 2021, Connected Through Community. Our annual conference will be October 17th through the 20th in Houston. We have over 60 education sessions. We have 5 keynotes and an expo hall. And of course, we have a lot of opportunities for networking. So before we get started, there's a couple housekeeping. If you have questions today, please put it in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many questions as we can today. After the webinar ends, we will be sending out the presentation and a link to view the session. So please keep an eye on your email for that. I want to really thank everybody at ActiveNav for supporting ARMA and helping us put this together. It's because of their support that we're able to bring you these additional webinars and services. So with that, I will turn it over to Rich and Andrew.
Thank you, Michael, and I appreciate it. And we're happy to support, as always. And first, I'm going to introduce my teammate and co-presenter and let him introduce himself, invite him to introduce himself. Andrew, please feel free.
Thanks, Rich. My name is Andrew Cowan. I am the product owner for Discovery Center at ActiveNav. I get the joy of delivering product and talking about this stuff to people who are way smarter about these things than I am.
And my name is Rich Tolbert. I'm with a professional services organization within ActiveNav. So I help our customers install and implement and be successful with our solution, working on their information governance challenges. I've been in roles previously in professional services and specific to image, document, content management, information governance. And I've also been on the other side of the equation. I have not only consulted with the ActiveNav software years ago, I've also been a program manager in an industry for a number of years, and actually bought the ActiveNav software as part of our governance program. So I've been on both sides of the equation, a customer and also a service provider. So hopefully that'll give me some unique perspective for you. So we're going to begin with the next slide and discuss, the title of, today's topic, the elephant in the room, and set the stage. Unstructured data. Many of us are aware it's a huge problem and must be addressed. Today, about 80% of all corporate data, including regulated, sensitive data, is unstructured, text inside of documents, for example, with that figure expected to grow to as high as 90% by 2025. So the elephant in the room metaphor represents this big challenge, a challenge that some might prefer to not discuss due to the size of the challenge and what to be done about it. So where do we begin? Where do we start? So Andrew and I, as a description of the topic suggests, are going to begin by discussing 5 techniques, methods, approaches, ways to tackle, the problem, the challenge at hand to mitigate the risk of unstructured data. And we added a 6th topic for today's discussion, And that's a process to tie it all together in the form of a solution, so to speak. So we'll begin with the 5, and then we'll wrap it up with the 6. And Andrew and I will tag team, these topics between ourselves for you. So first, on the topic of how to balance the growth of data with increased privacy risk. One does not have to search very far and very long to locate a past or present study regarding the growth and anticipated growth of data. Growth is often explained as exponential growth rather than linear growth. Some of the more relevant and recent reasons for such growth could include surplus cloud resources, for example. Available data capacity that might have been limited to some degree in the past within one's own data center has been superseded oftentimes with practically boundless available capacity included with our online business subscriptions. The plethora of devices embedded with our infrastructures and the prevailing nature of our mobile devices provide the means to generate more and more structured data. And undoubtedly, with that greater amount of structured data comes the work and the processes and the workflows and the subsequent unstructured data growth that comes along with the structured data. The abundant numbers of our mobile devices and the increased presence of automation in our workplaces provide additional opportunities for transactional data and associated unstructured data to grow with it. Evolving privacy regulations are certainly something to be considered, and as a challenge and as an opportunity and as a responsibility more and more. No matter where you're headquartered, privacy laws are a growing operational challenge. Currently, more than 120 major jurisdictions have passed or proposed privacy regulations, including those in California, the European Union, which many of us might be familiar with, New York, Brazil, Virginia, and most recently, within the last couple of weeks, I believe, even reading the newspaper as I do, most recently in Colorado. And you can see by the color coding in this chart, there are many states and many jurisdictions that are in some stage or step of the process of considering enacting something more specific. And of course, within the US here, otherwise, we default back to a 1974, I believe, federal statute in this regard, which, one can consider needs an update possibly, as some organizations have, as some jurisdictions have been doing so. Overall, non-compliance with privacy regulation represents a growing financial reputational risk for businesses. And the legislative trend highlights the importance for organizations of all sizes to have a privacy program in place that's compliant today and can adapt for the future. So how to balance the growth of data with increased privacy risk? Balancing that growth often arrives as a net new task. From more data and greater confidentiality concerns, these tasks must oftentimes be managed alongside our ongoing activities. One of the challenges becomes how to do more with less time, that is. And given we know our data continues to grow exponentially, the volume of data and demands upon our time dictate the need for technology to assist. In addition, as is often the case, the tool or technology should support our organization's specific processes. Even more so true within regulated scenarios, but rather than ask our organization to work the way a given tool or technology works. And finally, the technology or tool should support broad and specific searches for information of a private or confidential nature, such as being able to search for keywords that might indicate the presence of such confidential or sensitive information within a document, such as being able to recognize patterns that might indicate the presence of such information, such as patterns found, that patterns matched from text found that might indicate some sort of a government unique personal identifiers, credit card numbers, email addresses, phone numbers, addresses, etc. And lastly, such as being able to identify and locate specific identifying values that represent an individual, such as a specific customer requesting such information, from a vendor, supplier, or from former employees for which the information should be purged as required by statute, possibly. So I'm going to move on and share the floor now with Andrew, who's going to discuss methods for discovering, mapping, and classifying unstructured data. Andrew?
Thanks, Rich. Actually, I do want to follow up on one of the things that you said just at the end there, where you're talking about choosing tools to help you in your endeavor to manage all of this stuff. There are a lot of different tools out there that sort of are adjacent to the problem, that are very close to the problem, but don't address some of the more specific requirements in the information management, information governance sort of side of things. You get a lot of tools from the IT world that talk about access control or storage content management and searching and all those kinds of things, but they aren't focused on the specific ideas of information management or information discovery. There's a lot of overlapping concepts between those different tools and a lot of overlapping words that we use that are sort of very similar to those kinds of things. I think it's really important to look for tools that not only answer the broader questions, but the very specific questions that you have for the information governance, information management programs that you're trying to put in place, and making sure that those fit into the policies and the IT infrastructure, but also the practices that your organization has. How does your organization manage this information? How do they go through the processes of working through the different repositories that might exist? What the actions that might be required for on that content? So a lot of the time we'll end up talking to customers who have tried to use other tools that are sort of beside the idea of information governance. There'll be more sort of information management or searching tools or IT infrastructure management tools, but they miss a lot of the sort of additional things that are required for information management. So finding the right tool that gives you the ability to find that content and to map who it belongs to, where it belongs in the organization, and doing that classification stuff that we tend to talk quite a bit about. And I just want to give you one quick example of that, where you have an IT tool which looks at data content or document repositories solely from the IT perspective. Where does it exist on my network, and what kind of a repository is it? There's very little consideration for who the information belongs to, what policies might be in place for that kind of thing. The fact that a particular or part of your organization, say the finance department, might have repositories or information stored on different repositories throughout the organization. So when you try to take those tools that come at the problem from a particular perspective, they don't always line up particularly well with the goals that you're trying to achieve when you're talking about managing your unstructured data. And this is like just a very simple example of how that challenge can be when you're trying to talk to your data owners and your data custodians about the differences between how you look at that information and how you manage them. Policies might be different between the different parts of the organization, but those different policies may have to be applied to different repositories inside your organization. And that can be a bit of a challenge for tools that don't come at the problem from the information governance kind of perspective of things. There's a lot more to that, and I'm sure that folks on the call here are way more intimately familiar with these problems as well. But I think it's a key important thing to think about when you're looking for solutions to help you get through that, the capability of finding that information and being able to understand it and manage it in those different ways.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that. And I will move on now and take us into our third of 5 specific topics regarding ways to mitigate the risk of unstructured data. And let's talk a little bit about how to leverage automation for defensible data deletion. And for those of you that might know me and have worked with me in the past, I do love some automation. So first and foremost, defensible data itself, the concept and the term. Part of the role or purpose of information governance might be to quite simply eliminate that which is unnecessary, which can in turn ease access and the findability of the information that remains, better protect and preserve the information that remains, and also reduce one's risk from any unnecessary information that might have remained otherwise. Permanent or removing unnecessary information the proper way might be better supported after the fact and down the line if necessary, if the activity is routine, matter of fact, periodic, and regular in its nature. It might also be better supported if the activity involves all information, that is non-records, such as unfinished and unapproved drafts and reference material, in addition to records themselves. And finally, one could also argue that it's best supported if done according to an organization's up-to-date records retention schedule. I might also mention other aspects important for defensible deletion, and those would be properly developed, documented, and approved policies, processes, and procedures, communications, and training also. But why is defensible data deletion difficult sometimes? Can be a challenge for reasons discussed previously and related to privacy concerns, including the larger and larger amounts of data and maintaining our focus on our existing roles and responsibilities. It can also be made more difficult if data deletion is not something we have been accustomed to date. My best example of this is an imaging implementation I once completed a number of years ago. And as we went to go live and I went to collect the paper invoices from someone to do the first day's imaging and to demonstrate the implementation, there was physically, that person was just holding on to those invoices and didn't want to let go. And sometimes defensible data deletion can be difficult in a similar manner. If someone's not used to this sort of a governance, management, cleanup activity, it can be difficult to let go of old habits. Not being able to let go sometimes manifests itself in users trying to make backup copies of their electronic data, taking paper records home, etc. I'm sure we all have some stories to tell in these regards. Finally, event-based retention can be a challenge, as not many of us have what seems like a luxury of having our operations and back office systems supplying dates for our record keeping and information governance systems. So event-based retention can make it a challenge also. So how do we tie these things together and how to leverage automation for defensible data deletion? First, validate the processes and tools so that you can subsequently trust the automation. The investment of time up front will be returned as time saved over and over and as time goes on. Automate records classification, which means automatically categorizing and assigning electronic files or documents to record codes from one's records retention schedule. This can subsequently introduce the possibility of properly applying retention periods in an automated manner within one's data deletion activities, making them more defensible. Consider updating one's records retention schedule, by converting event-based retention rules to time-based. While this may very well mean rounding up some retention periods, it could eliminate the need or minimize or decrease the need to track the business event dates required for some event-based retention and disposition record codes. And finally, schedule in advance and on a regular basis data deletion activities so that they might be considered regular and routine and matter of fact, for example. Next, Andrew is going to take us into the topic of a topic more and more coming to the forefront these days, Microsoft information protection and labeling, and tips for leveraging that within your information governance program. Andrew?
Thanks, Rich. I think this actually falls on quite nicely from the automation perspective. The idea behind Microsoft's information protection labeling is that you embed classification tags into the documents as they exist in the repository. So that can be everything from when a user creates a document to when a tool discovers the document and applies a particular classification to that document and embeds that information protection or information sensitivity label into the document itself. So the document can then tell systems the sensitivity or the value that the document has for the organization. And that brings an immense opportunity for organizations to use that centralized policy of information protection labels from Microsoft to enforce those control points on those documents. So not just sharing documents outside of the organization, but also between different organizations, where content can be stored, and how that information is protected, all based on that single platform across the MIP environment. So all of the tools within M365 being able to take advantage of that information that's stored inside the document. So a document tells the DLP, or it tells the email system, or it tells the retention tool, or it tells even the reporting tools, this is what the classification and sensitivity that the particular document has, and allows those enforcement and control and management reports to be able to automatically tell the system, to tell the users, to tell the reporting structure what the classification of a particular document is. MIP brings a few other things to the table, the labels that I've already talked about, protection and encryption. The protection piece can be the parts of the MIP infrastructure itself that actually can protect the content about where it can be shared to, who's allowed to access that information, but it can also automatically provide encryption as well. So if you're in an environment where you have to provide a higher level of protection around that document so that you have encrypted content, that MIP infrastructure can give you that piece automatically. So the automation of the data classification and the automation of enforcing the control points for that information becomes easier because the document itself can tell the system that's asking the question what its classification is. And I'm just going to have a quick sort of little diagram of kind of how things might lay out for a particular organization. You've got stuff on premise, you've got file shares or SharePoint. You move into the Microsoft 365 environment. The MIP data classification tools that exist can embed the labels into that content. So no matter where inside of the M365 environment that document exists, whether that's SharePoint or Teams or OneDrive, or even in attachments in email messages, though all of those labels can then drive the protection across to the sharing piece, the reporting piece, and email as one of the specific examples of data leakage. That ability to have a single data classification structure that is across your IT infrastructure is very valuable, very powerful. It can be a bit of a challenge to do the configuration and the management of those kinds of things, but the investment in that labeling infrastructure can really reap benefits when it comes to raising the awareness, being able to report on the content back to the organization so that the organization understands where content is stored, what's the value of the information that's stored in a particular, let's say in a particular file share, or the content that belongs to a particular organization, so that you can have measurable ways of describing how information is protected, how information is controlled, and the kinds of information that your organization is managing on a day-to-day basis, being able to report that just straight out of the documents that have that information in it. There's lots of different ways you can do data classification. This is one of them that is, as Rich mentioned, becoming more of an interesting aspect of the way our customers are talking about it, as most people are driving towards the Microsoft 365 environment. That's one of the things that tends to come along with the MIP piece, and understanding how you can use that specific function, that specific feature, in order to advance the information classification side of things to help you with information governance and information protection.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that. Terrific stuff. And now to move on to our fifth topic of the original five, how to minimize duplicate and rot data in terms of, managing the risk from unstructured and sensitive information. The acronym ROT, often defined as redundant, obsolete, and trivial, can be used to describe information identified as candidates for deletion, as the information is often considered of little value. The redundant in ROT could include duplicate copies of electronic files or documents, and it could also include dissimilar files with identical viewable, printable, readable content otherwise. So the difference might only be in the hidden headers of the documents, for example. The obsolete in ROT might include information that is older than a specific age, for which information or one or more categories of information is deemed to no longer be of value to an organization. And finally, the trivial in ROT could include certain types of files or documents of little value otherwise, such as files considered temporary in nature, persist no useful data, and may be produced automatically by some applications and left behind. But why minimize duplicative and rot data? Minimizing duplicative and rot data might benefit one's organization for several reasons, including reduced file storage space used, which could in turn decrease one's storage cost overall. Potentially, an impactful benefit from reduced storage space used is that the remaining content might be easier to locate as one filters through a smaller folder or search result sets of content. This time and effort-focused advantage of increased findability could have a profound impact upon lowering one's cost. Finally, related to defensible data deletion, legitimately reducing one's obsolete information if possible could reduce one's risk from the information persisting over time within an organization. This minimized risk could reduce the internal or third-party costs subsequently associated with culling through one's data in response to external requests for the information. But how to minimize duplicative and rot data? While duplicate or redundant copies of files might be based upon file hash values calculated from algorithms and therefore similar for organizations, what could be considered obsolete or trivial could be specific to organizations and different as you go from organization to organization. So the ability to tailor or customize rules that categorize files or documents as obsolete should be considered as critical to organizations, such as specifying how old files should be or documents must be to be considered obsolete. That age might be different between organizations. The ability to tailor or customize rules that categorize files or documents as trivial should be considered as critical to organizations, such as specifying file types in combination with other metadata for documents to be considered trivial. Those rules, those guidelines, those parameters might be different between different organizations. I often summarize critical components for focus within change management as executive support, communications, and training. However, an additional option for leverage regarding this topic is to make it easy upon those affected. That's another form of change management, so to speak. Making something easy for business users can be argued to increase the value of whatever it is to those affected users. That's something gained that those users receive, and if they receive it with little effort on their part, could increase the value of that action, governance program results, for example, and could be a win-win for everyone involved. The end users, maybe they didn't have to spend as much time involved in the effort, yet they still reap the benefits of findability and minimize risk and lower cost. And the information governance programs achieves its objectives also and is successful. So one possibility to consider for eliminating duplicate and rot data is to define a set of rules that everyone could and does agree with. Then act over and over upon those approved rules without requiring unique approvals each act. Every time you do a remediation effort, every single file within the remediation effort, the concept being define the rules, get the rules approved, approve the rules once, and then as you reuse the rules, you can do so without necessarily having to involve the business each and every time as the business approved the rules previously. Schedule in advance and on a regular basis duplicative and rot information identification and any subsequent action upon that data so that they might be considered regular, routine, and investments are routinely recouped each time the governance program takes action. With that said, we are through our first 5 topics, and as promised, Andrew's going to tie it all together in an end-to-end solution and process, for example. Andrew?
Thanks, Rich. It's interesting that you talked about the rules and the policy, because I always put that at the very beginning of all of this, because all of your business drivers have to be agreed upon before you even enter into this kind of program. You have to know why you're doing it, what are your goals, what's the value that this thing is going to bring to the organization before you even crack open the web browser and start looking for solutions for this. And I think we've seen that with some of our customers where they're like, we need a solution, go find one, and then find out whether or not they can shoehorn that solution in with the policies and goals that they have in place, or does the solution come back and say, no, you have to change the way you think about your organization so that you can fit our tool. And I think that's, it's interesting that you finished on that piece. And in my head, it's always the very first thing that you come up with is having that, the goal for the program in place. I know a lot of folks probably already have that in there, but it has to be the kind of thing where not just the information governance folks, but also the business owners, the executive sponsorship are also all on board with those things so that you can help to drive through the questions that arise as you kind of put these kind of solutions together. And I'll start with this end-to-end one in the usual kind of left-hand side where you start with discovering the content that you have there, looking for all of the different repositories where your information might be stored, which different ones are under your control that you know have particular content in it, who owns that particular one, both from a custodial perspective, but also from a business perspective, who owns the data that's in there, having a good inventory of what's out there, what belongs in there, where it's been spread out across your IT infrastructure to give you a picture that can help you do a couple of things in these programs. The first one is knowing how big of a problem you have. I think a lot of folks are a little bit optimistic about how quickly they'll be able to get a handle on handling things like ROD or handling just information governance in general. You won't know what that looks like until you know how much stuff is out there, how much content is out there, all the different repositories where that might reside. A tool that can go through and gives you that discovery, paint you some nice pretty pictures, give you some insight into how old that information is, where it might reside, and who might actually own that stuff, gives you a good lead into actually going and doing things. So the first one usually tends to be identifying rot and then actually executing a disposition on that content. That initial report, the sort of understanding of where the problem areas arise can help you to prioritize which parts of that unstructured data mass that you have you want to attack first, which one's the most important, which one's the biggest problem child that you have, the ones that maybe you're okay with for now, we'll get to those in the future, sort of aligning that kind of stuff, and then going through reducing the amount of that rot that might be in your organization so that you can, because the rot problem is not going to get any smaller on its own. It's a good place to start to help reduce the information management, information governance problem down to the information that's actually required in the organization, whether that's content that is currently active and used by the business, or whether that's the record side of things where you have retention policy on that content. At the same time as you're going through and identifying that content, a solution like Discovery Center or other tools as well can look at the content and help you to identify not only whether it's rot or whether it is not rot, it's important as well, but also what value that content brings to your organization. So using that classification ideas we talked a little bit about in order to sort of tag this content and say, I know that this has a value for this part of the organization. I know that it belongs to that part of the organization. I know that this is what the retention schedule might be for that particular record. As you go through looking for that raw information, you can also build up a good understanding of the content that's in there to apply the policies that you have, those goals that I talked about at the very beginning, with a data model that understands the business goals and how to identify that content as it's been found inside of your repository. So being able to build up the taxonomies that you might have to be able to apply those taxonomies to give that information back to the data owners to say, well, this is where your content is residing. This is the kind of information that belongs to your department or your organization, and then point back up to those goals about how we should now manage that information based on some very well understood set of rules, data models that can be explained back to the business about how you're doing those kinds of things. And that's generally, I'd say that's a pretty good point to sort of pause and think about how as your business changes, as your business grows, that data model is something that is not always set in stone. There are going to be parts of it that are going to be dictated to you by legislation or jurisdictional things. Sometimes it's in the specific industry that you might have to be in, but there are also going to be changes in your business that are going to slowly change that model as you grow and change the way the business works. So it's important to remember that it's not necessarily written down once and you never go back to it. But that's kind of the starting point where you're like, we need to again look at our goals, take a look at what the data model is that we have for that for our organization and the data that we handle on a daily basis. Then as you go into the sort of identifying that content, applying that metadata tags to that content so that you can use that to execute those business policies, so that you know that this information is highly critical. It needs to be handled in a specific type of way, or this information belongs to a particular organization, or it has specific sensitivities that have particular let's say jurisdictional implications on legal implications on how it has to be stored, where it can be stored, who can have access to it. That metadata tagging comes straight out of that data model, where you now know what kind of information it is, and then being able to identify that very easily within some management tool like Discovery Center that says, show me all of the information that belongs to the finance department that is PII information. And that metadata tagging makes it very easy for a tool like ours to be able to show that to not only the information management folks, but also to the data owners themselves, either with the pretty pictures and the graphs or actual lists of files, depending on the particular thing that you're trying to do. One of the things that folks are trying to do these days is to migrate from their on-premise systems into the cloud environment. M365 is, I think, the big gorilla in the room. There are other repositories as well out there, but being able to use that metadata tagging that's based on the modeling, that's based on the values and the goals you're trying to achieve for your organization, gives you an easy way to identify the priority and the location for migrating that content. So you know who owns the information, what the structure of that repository should look like when you're driving it up from the on-premise system and into something that's in the cloud, SharePoint Online, for example, or Teams, where you're using that as an opportunity, not just to reduce storage costs, to make things more highly available, whatever those kinds of gains from the IT structure, IT side of things, but also from just an opportunity to identify the value of content to the organization, also restructure that content so that the users of that information know where to find that information more easily in a well-planned hierarchy of repositories, rather than just the organic changes that we get with on-premise systems that have been around for years. Now that we've got all of that beautiful, fancy new repository with metadata tags and reporting, then you turn into the governance side, where you start to repeat that process as you go through the scheduling and the repeatable actions on that content to give you a strong position to stand on from an information governance perspective, give you that defensible deletion, to give you that management side of it, where you've got somebody, some systems scanning through the content to identify information that maybe has been placed in the wrong location, or maybe has the wrong data classification associated with it, be able to report that information back to the organization, back to both on the IT side, but also on the data owner side, and up management chains, to show how well that information is being managed, how the content is being protected, also from a regulatory perspective as well, to be able to have that written down as policies you can point to about how your information is being managed and stored across your organization. I think I'm out of breath now. Sorry. So there you go. There's the 5+1 things that we covered today. I'm going to let Rich close this all up with some words of wisdom.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate terrific information. And it's been great to collaborate with you today in this regard. So that elephant in the room, that big challenge that some might not prefer to discuss, and how to tackle it, approaching the issue, one step at a time. Problem decomposition, breaking the bigger problem challenge into smaller ones, and work on them sometimes independently or in combination, and it adds up and sums up to address the challenge as a whole in the end. A little bit about ActiveNav, the organization Andrew and I are so proud to be a part of. With our ActiveNav solutions, you can map, clean, classify, quarantine, and delete sensitive, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. And some of our larger customers include Equifax, FOIA, and the U.S. Marine Corps. Being a veteran myself, I'm very proud of that fact. So with that said, I think we're going to transition the floor to questions.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Rich and Andrew. Very informative, insightful presentation. And we had a number of questions come in, so I'm going to kind of pretty much fire them in the way they came in, with a little bit of my own interpretation. So, Rich, I think the first question is for you. What tips do you have for the change management aspect of data management projects, so that the resources that we spend on these projects don't go to waste?
Tips that we have for change management, aside from maybe some of the things I've mentioned, so thinking about answering the question with some additional pieces of information, having some change management expertise within the governance team. The governance team, the project team, the operational team will often be a matrix team, a cross-section from legal and IT and records and compliance, and maybe some representatives from the business, maybe someone from HR, someone in there, bring forward some complete, robust change management expertise, maybe signing up and have gone through some change management training, aware of methodology, aware of processes and tools. And for an information governance program, since they can often run a lengthy duration of time, put together plans, have an overall plan for change management, much less a plan for the information governance, aspects of the project, such as the process Andrew pulled us through there a few minutes ago. But have an information governance plan, how to go about getting executive support, maintaining that, retaining that, growing, nurturing it, communications plan. When I ran a program, I had a multi-year communications plan, but every single month, here was the communication that was going out, here was the template, here's who it's going to, and the next month, you knew what was going to occur, what was going to be sent out, and why. And a training plan also. how to train those that are affected by the information governance program, how to train those that participate in the information governance program. So some change management expertise and formalizing that part of the project through plans and processes.
Oh, thanks. I think there's a couple of questions came in, I think, Andrew, mostly for you. There are a couple of questions around the Microsoft protection labels, and like a series of, can you apply them to documents and emails in Exchange? Does Microsoft have a canned default set of sensitivity labels, or do you create your own? And then I think they're fairly simple, straightforward answers. And the third question around labels is, how do you train your employees to use them? So I took the first two as easy ones, and now to throw the third one in. Really interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I certainly appreciate the questions about the MIP. It is a topic that is near and dear to my heart from a previous life. The MIP infrastructure is completely customizable. So the set of labels that you choose for sensitivity is completely up to you. There is lots of disagreement in the industry, if there is such a thing as the labeling industry, about how many labels should you have and what should they be called and all that kind of stuff. And having spent more than 10, I feel so old now, more than 10 years working on that stuff, I will say it's very cultural. Inside your organization, you have to have a set of labels that make sense for your business. It's probably the hardest part of all of that information classification side of things is defining what that means for you. And it will be different from organization to organization, even in the same industry, because you will have your own information security policy and you'll have your own jurisdictional requirements that you have to fit in, privacy stuff, all that kind of stuff. So you will be able to, with the MIP world, come up with your own, but that is almost the hardest thing to do in the environment. In terms of applying those labels, end users can apply those labels within the Office application. So I'm sitting inside of Word, I type up a document, I hit the save button. The policy that's in place could force me to choose the label for that. It may just allow me to choose one, and it'll embed that right then and there when I go to save the document. You could also deploy MIP labeling just within the Teams and SharePoint environment or the Exchange environment, so that those tools look at the content, looking for patterns and keywords and identifying content types, and using rules in that sense to apply the labels that you've decided on. So there is the ability for the end user to do that kind of stuff, and it can be a challenge to educate folks on what that stuff means. A lot of it is education. It is communication plan. It's letting people know that there is an information security policy in place. There's a data protection policy in place, that there's IT security rules in place. I know that every place that I've worked for in the last 20 years, again, feeling old again, being able, when you sign up to the job, you have all these forms you have to fill out and sign them, and one of them is information security policy. And that's the last time I looked at it, right? You don't think about it anymore. For data labeling to become a useful tool inside the organization, it has to be something that people do daily, that they see daily, that they feel daily, that it has an impact on their life in their job and what they do. And that's really the hardest cultural change that I think there is with the data classification piece. It is a challenge to express those things to folks. There's lots of different ways you can do that, but it really is a communications and training thing that you have to go through.
Okay. Thank you. This is, I guess, consider this a toss-up question. If you have any recommendations for implementing an automated deletion schedule when it hasn't happened previously, how do you help acceptance of this new normal through the lens of culture change? I think, Rich, you touched on that a little bit with the change management. I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Certainly. I think I might start by working to identify specifically the value the organization would receive from this change. And then I'd build upon that with the business community, the user base, you know, raise some awareness as to what the issue is today, raise some awareness as to how things could change, work to create a desire so that the business users want that change and get to the point of demanding that change. Why aren't we doing this, for example? And communicate and train, share the knowledge, create the ability within the organization to be a part of this change and to help execute the change. And much like I said, with communications and executive sponsorship and support and training, reinforce, over and over as time goes on. So I think that the answer to that question, when it hasn't been there before and you want to go there, it begins with, raising an awareness of what it is that you want to do and why, and creating that desire within the organization so that they want to go with you.
Sure. So another question, do you have any tips for protecting unstructured data without any tools and a legal hold?
So with a legal hold, but without tools. Thinking back and my prior experiences, particularly on the user side of things, going into an organization, there would likely be or could be or should be a process in place, for manual execution of a legal hold. So upon receipt of a discovery request, for example, here's what the legal department's going to do. Here's what they might, identify, those that need to be included, communicate out, request certain action from them, collect the information in some form, some manner, somewhere within the organization, protect it, preserve it, whatever follow-ups might be required. So I think without any tools in place, yet the need to do so, it would seem like the next logical place to begin would be developing a process on paper, be it a manual process potentially, and getting that reviewed and approved, published, share the knowledge, communicate, and then have it there to execute when needed. But at the same time, in parallel, I would also realize and recognize, if we're just now getting to the point of manually describing a process for that, in parallel, we need to start up a different track of work and effort to identify and bring in some tools and automate and make it easier on our business users, yet keep the organization whole and safe and secure also.
So I'm not sure, maybe this is for Andrew, but in the workflow order, how can you model / tag without rework after cleansing? The sequence appears as a potential for redundant work.
Yeah, I think that it may be that you do your modeling beforehand, but it can be a bit of a challenge to understand what your data is before you know what's there. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. You're going to have when I put it onto the workflow in that way, that's modeling within the tool as opposed to modeling beforehand, and before you get your hands on a bit of software to do it. That was more in the process of the actual application. The modeling for ROT tends to be around the identification of the files from what the repository tells you about when was this file created, when's the last time it was accessed, those kinds of things, which doesn't depend on modeling the content of the data, which is the majority of the modeling piece that you have to do. So it's not, it don't have to be in either particular order. You could do all of your modeling beforehand if you wanted to, but it does tend to be more useful to have reduced the amount of content that you have to look at to build your model, so you're not basing that model on older information or information that just it kind of bloats the amount of content that you're looking at, or might give you a particularly skewed view of what your content might be in there. You don't have to do it in either particular order. I think Rich probably has some ideas in practice about what it's been like for him with our customers, but there's nothing that says that information, that work is going to be wasted whether you do it one way or the other, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that, that process chart kind of, makes one pass through in a linear manner for simplicity's sake and ease of discussion. And, if you peel back a layer, there might be a little bit, more detail. Again, problem decomposition, breaking things down. We use categorization techniques early on in order to perform the rock cleanup and the sensitive data protection and preservation. We use some of those same categorization tools and approaches and techniques and technologies for the modeling aspect. Just the modeling, I think, as Andrew was saying, is a bit of a focused reference to if after cleaning up rot and if after protecting and preserving sensitive data, maybe moving it elsewhere to a more secure location. For example, the remaining information that has value to an organization, so to speak, maybe the goal is to reorganize that and migrate it to another platform. Maybe the goal is or to auto-classify that information and assign record codes to it for proper, retention and disposition, for example. So I think we kind of focus that modeling with a capital M, so to speak, on that work, because it tends to be a little bit more future focused. We want to reorganize the information. We want to apply retention and disposition to it, but we're using some of the same tools and techniques and technologies both before and after and during that modeling step of that chart.
So trying to get as many as I can. How do you index data in place without moving or copying?
So you get down into the weeds of how the product works. Discovery Center does not have any agents that get deployed. It's a single system that it gets deployed in your data center, and it makes connections out to those locations. Those connections are made depending on what kind of repository it is. If it's a file system, NTFS or whatever it is, or if it's a SharePoint site, use the SharePoint APIs for making those calls. And it identifies those through those calls by saying, well, tell me what the repository attributes are. What's the file name, who's the owner, what's the last modified date, all that kind of stuff. And that gets sent back and stored into SQL database and modeling tools inside the Discovery Center in the gobbledygook that I don't understand. When we are looking at the content itself, we do have to go and grab that file, because there's no way to identify what the content that is in the repository itself, because there's no solution that's sitting there reading that content there. So the actual file is sent back to the Discovery Center. The Discovery Center has the ability to take that content, break it out into plain text, and do the analysis looking for those patterns and keywords and all the content-y kind of things in order to build up those data classifications, extraction rules and classifications that we do after the fact. But once that analysis has happened, the extracted content, the bits and pieces that are going to be used to build up your classifications and identification are kept inside the database. The actual content of that document is then removed from the system. It's not retained anywhere. We don't maintain a complete index of all of the information. That one of the things about Discovery Center is it tends to be a lot smaller in terms of its data footprint for storing that information, because it doesn't maintain a full text index of all the repositories that you're pointing it to. And I don't know, maybe Rich has some corrections to my description of how that works.
Yeah, we certainly, crawl repositories, file systems, SharePoint, Exchange, other document content repositories, and cloud-based, storage systems on-premise and such. But we can quite literally crawl with read-only permissions, and we're creating an index, an inventory, and an index, an inventory plus additional metadata. And some of that metadata, as Andrew described, is from the file properties themselves and whatever repository they might be. created date, modified date, owner, etc. And then there's probably a lot more of that metadata that we might, for example, create according to the business's rules, record codes assigned, sensitive data found within the documents, type of rot identified the documents as. So as we create information, metadata, data that describes the files, data that describes the primary data, we're storing that, for example, in an index in an application database separate from the file system. So we can quite literally crawl a repository with read-only permissions, because the information that we're writing is information that describes the content, and we store that more at a home base, so to speak, not in the repository itself. In addition, we can write back metadata to the repository itself if that's also desired. We do that too. But even without that, being used in a particular solution, we're reading information and recording it for reporting purposes, and action purposes later, by the governance program.
All right, we are out of time. Thank you, ActiveNav. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will do our best to answer the questions that were submitted that we did not have the time to address today. And everybody will be getting a copy of this presentation hopefully tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.